Welcome to the Berkshires Gone By, history and folklore about the westernmost and most beautiful county in Massachusetts. I'm your host, Brooke. Rushing water has long been the lifeblood of the Berkshires. The wild, winding, narrow rivers turned the works of mills that sprang up along them, which, in turn, helped the Berkshires thrive. But what the rivers give, they can also take away, for from the earliest grist mills, there were floods to destroy them, one of the earliest on record being in the 1700s, which rushed through North Adams, then called East Hoosick, and destroyed a number of mills and a grist mill. Floods like this were normal for the area, especially in spring, when they were often caused by melting snow and ice, called freshets, and would sweep down from the mountains. But with few people living in the area at the time, little damage was done. However, as the population increased, damming rivers and streams became common practice in the Berkshires in order to harness the power of these waters. Even the smallest creeks could be dammed to create ponds. The dam would then channel the water into a narrow chute that might lead to a large wooden wheel that this water would then cause to turn. These old mills could be fashioned to do a great number of things, like running large saws with which to cut wood, or turning flat millstones to then make flour. But in the early days, dams were made of things, and with techniques that weren't truly trustworthy. In addition, villages and towns were often built along streams or rivers. Later, when those waterways were dammed and the water flow downstream was lessened, people over the years would perhaps become too used to the altered shoreline and encroach upon the edges. This wasn't a problem until those unreliable dams gave way. And after an entire day of rain, in October of 1869, on the 4th of that month, a number of mill dams began to fail. A dam upstream would let go, sending a rush of water down to another dam. This might happen again and again, until the added excess of water became catastrophic, and this rush became a flood. Those towns nearby, who'd grown used to their smaller stream, were shocked when the power harnessed from it for so long was once again wild. This particular flood destroyed homes, mills, roads, bridges, anything in its path really, and after the torrent had drained away, $100,000 in damages were left behind. That's $1,726,000 in 2017 money. You'll see North Adams come up a lot in this episode, as a place more affected by flood than others. This has a lot to do with topography, as well as history. First, Adams and North Adams both were towns with a large number of mills, which meant a large number of dams, both big and small. Other Berkshire towns have and had mills too, but not quite to the same extent. Second, there were mountains. North Adams not only has one of the larger rivers and river systems in the county, but is also surrounded by mountains, unlike Pittsfield, which also had a large number of mills, but was built on flatter ground, where the extra water has room to spread out. Flat land where water is allowed to spread means that the water is not moving at quite the same speed as it might be if it's coming from the mountainsides. Being pinned between mountains means that a waterway has nowhere to expand. It can only accumulate and speed up until it eventually reaches a flat expanse, called a floodplain, further downstream. Floodplains are important to river systems and vital to controlling flood waters. These marshy flat areas absorb excess water like a sponge, and tend to be areas where the river course has a chance to zigzag back and forth, which makes it hard for rushing waters to maintain high speed. Unfortunately, floodplains also collect silt and sediment, which can make very rich topsoil, and of course, farmers love that. So, Homes and barns were often built on floodplains, which put more people and property in the way of possible disaster. East Lee was hit with a crushing flood in April of 1886, when a dam on the Greenwater Brook, called Mud Pond Dam, which fed power to a number of major industrial mills, burst. With a deafening rumble, a wall of water swept through the village. The sleeping people, for this was early in the day, had no warning. Most of the village was destroyed. 7 people died. The 11 paper companies that had collectively constructed the dam had taken little interest in the many years after its completion, and had totally missed signals of its weakening state. Their meetings on the topic of their shared ownership of the dam were held as little more than conversations at the general store, and a serious maintenance department never manifested before it was too late. Mills were destroyed, people left jobless, the area's economy heavily impacted, 30 families were made homeless, and lives were lost because of a group of men to whom business was more important than safety. Surviving mills moved to the center of town, along the Housatonic River, and production resumed. This wasn't the first time this sort of thing had happened in western Massachusetts by any means. Not far east, in Hampshire County, in the town of Williamsburg, a dam had been neglected so long that in 1874 it gave way. The resulting torrent of water destroyed factories, homes, washed out roads, and ended the lives of 139 people. The villages nearby of Haydenville, Skinnerville, and Leeds were also washed away as the rushing waters swept downstream. No one was ever held accountable for the many deaths. What was left of most of the villages was rebuilt, all but Skinnerville, which never was. The Bassett Reservoir was a man-made one, and after 2 days of heavy downpours, in 1901, on the 19th and 20th of August, the dam that had held it contained quickly crumbled. The excess water unleashed led to the nearby Dean's Dam, rupturing as well, which let loose a wall of water on the town of Adams. The flood tore trolley tracks from the streets, shoved buildings from their foundations, and swept them down the road. Mills were destroyed and damaged. Renfro Company and the Berkshire Mills were hard hit, damages roughly totaling $280,000, $7 million today, and 1 man was killed. Affected areas also included North Adams and Williamstown as well, but to a lesser extent. In 1922, a small flood caused a bit of damage, but nothing compared to the next one 5 years later, in 1927. A day and a half, on the 3rd and 4th of November, of rain, equaling about 7 inches, drenched North County. 10 homes were demolished by the water that came rushing through town. Bridges were destroyed, businesses ruined. Valiant residents helped all they could to save each other and assist firemen. To that date, it was the worst flood in that area ever recorded. $2 million in damages were tallied. Thankfully, no one in the Berkshires was killed. Vermont, however, suffered even more extreme damage, and 200 people died during the storm around New England and the Hudson Valley area of New York State, similar to the sort that would occur 9 years later. The Great Flood of 1936 wasn't quite as great in the Berkshires as other locations, which was, of course, a good thing. That March, a few bridges were washed away, and a small landslide destroyed a property in North Adams along West Main Street. The worst of it was felt in Adams, after the homes of 60 families were destroyed. $100,000, $1,760,000 in modern money, was estimated in damages. 60 families homeless may seem like no small thing, but the rest of the state had it far worse. Greater damages were felt in Vermont, New Hampshire, and the Pioneer Valley of western Massachusetts, along with parts of Connecticut. An unfortunate aspect to the damaging nature to the floods of this particular year was the cold and ice. Large blocks of ice would become lodged in waterways, causing more water to back up, which caused floodings in places not used to flooding. This could then rupture, releasing walls of water downstream. These blockages are called ice jams, and are still a danger along rivers today. When spotted, dynamite was sometimes used to blow them up before floodwaters could back up behind them. It was often employed through the years, and still is today. Countless homes, businesses, buildings, farms, roads, railways were all torn apart. People all over the region fled their homes, some by boat, after the waters had become too high or too rough for them to leave by foot. Many families didn't know if loved ones were okay for days afterward. However, the high water marks from a flood only 2 years later, in 1938, still stand today as some of the highest on record. Northampton, Irving, Holyoke, Springfield, Montague, Lowell, Haverhill, Lawrence, Northfield, Hatfield, Hadley were among some of the towns most devastated. This flooding extended even to the Saco River in Maine. Waters in the Pioneer Valley not only rose, but stayed. People clung to rooftops and what little high ground they could find, as the Pioneer Valley is quite flat compared to the Berkshires. Back in the Berkshires, North Adams was hit hard. Water racing through the town, along the rocky, shallow rivers, and down from the mountainsides, the creeks, unable to contain the torrents. Housatonic, situated at a bend in a river, found its bridges destroyed, and its mills and village flooded. Homes along the Housatonic and Great Barrington were damaged. So were those in Lee. All over the Berkshires, people sought refuge, where and when they could. Many deaths resulted from this flooding, in one form or another. A Mrs. Drury, from Williamstown, Vermont, suddenly fell over stone dead when she saw a local dam break to pieces. A father of 12 lost his life in Windham, Vermont, trying to save his mill. 2 children were swept into the Nashua River in New Hampshire. Another 2, aged 7 and 5, a boy and a girl, were killed when they fell into the rushing waters. In Hancock, Vermont, communication was cut off, as telegraph, phone, and electric poles were torn down. In some parts of New England, entire towns were cut off from the rest of the world when their roads were destroyed, and they were left with no way to call for help. Not even doctors could reach people who needed them, and it was soon that a great many were in need of a doctor. People clung to their homes as they were washed away. Their cars, after their vehicles became stranded, and trees, once they were swept into the water. Countless animals were killed, especially on farms. Captive in their pens or fenced into their fields, most were unable to reach higher ground. All over New England, everyday life came to a screeching and terrifying halt. In Holyoke, Mass., 15 feet of water crested the top of the massive Holyoke Power Dam. The peak of flood in West Hartford, Connecticut reached 35 feet. Montpelier, Vermont saw 10. Deerfield saw 20. The rain that had caused this flooding continued for 10 days, and even after it stopped, the water running down from the mountains continued to add to the water already there, and to that still coming downstream from places also affected further north. Meanwhile, people were cut off from help. Those with boats hurried to rescue who and what they could. Those marooned in or on buildings or high ground were left with little or nothing to eat and only contaminated water to drink. People would sometimes try to float to safety on rafts lashed together with whatever they could find. One of the most wretched factors to be battled with during the flooding was that it was September, and so quite cold at night. And though it may seem counterintuitive for many, The last thing they wanted was a fire to keep warm. Gas lines had been ruptured, and slicks of highly flammable gasoline and oil could be seen sliding atop the water as it passed by. A spark could mean that things would get even worse. In one sense, the cold was a blessing. It kept the bodies of all the dead animals that had been washed around from rotting. From Quebec to New Jersey, damage of some sort was suffered. In New Bedford, Massachusetts, 2/3 of the boats anchored in the harbor sank. The cause of all this flooding was two-stepped. 2 storms, one being a rainstorm and the next a hurricane. First, the rain brought the river waters high and saturated the ground to the point that it could take no more. The second let loose such quantities of rain that countless dams already stressed could not hold the waters. A 50-foot wave was reported just off the coast of Gloucester, Massachusetts. 150-mile-an-hour winds were reported on Long Island. The hurricane's track up the east coast from about Long Island area earned the storm the nickname the Long Island Express. Many entire forests were blown or washed over. Barns, being less reinforced internally, were easy prey for the winds and water. Numerous tobacco barns in the towns of Hadley and Hatfield were blown flat. Even the summer home of actress Katharine Hepburn was destroyed in Saybrook, Connecticut, and she narrowly escaped with her life. After the storm died down and the waters slowly drained away, people hurried to restore normal life. Homes had to be rebuilt, or those now homeless needed to find new accommodation. The dead had to be buried. But first, countless cemeteries had to be put right. Some of those, along waterways, had been partially washed away, and graves uncovered. The bodies of dead farm animals had to be recovered and disposed of before they began to rot. Countless items had to be cleared away from streets, riverbeds, farm fields, and forests, from home furnishings to the remains of entire bridges and automobiles. But New Englanders are known for their toughness, and with help from each other, most communities recovered. Remnants of the ruins of many mills that were never rebuilt can still be found along riverbanks, and the footings of dams that were washed out can still be found at the edges of streams. It was 10 whole years later before floods would again affect the Berkshires. In December of 1948, it began to rain, and didn't stop for 3 days. Blackington and North Adams were hardest hit. Homes on streets at lower elevations were destroyed, and Blackington Mill was damaged, along with a few bridges that were wiped away. But things were changing, and technology had advanced to a point that something might be done. Prevention became the aim to avoid future floods. In the North Adams area, U.S. Representative John W. Heselton and North Adams Mayor James Bowes demanded that a flood control project be initiated to control the potential of future disasters, to some degree. As a result, both North Adams and Adams were given funds to begin such work, and it didn't take long for that work to start. Flood control systems, channels, and drainage were built. The companies that remained in East Lee, however, hadn't learned their lesson, as yet another neglected dam burst in 1968. On the 24th of March, 1 factory was destroyed, 6 homes leveled, and 2 people killed, in the same area that had been swept away 82 years before. In late August of 2011, Hurricane Irene headed for the Berkshires, along with a great stretch of New England. Berkshire rivers swelled, low-lying roads flooded, and the rain poured from the dark sky. Brattleboro, Vermont flooded around the lower side of downtown, along the Connecticut River, and along the East River. Numerous covered bridges in the area were threatened, some rattling on their trusses. Many survived, but a few were lost. The road on one side of the Quechee-covered bridge in Quechee, Vermont, was partially swept away, and water began to pour across the floor of the wooden bridge. But it held strong and survived. In Taftsville, Vermont, tanks venting propane were swept over a dam. They raged with the foaming waters before being swept under the nearby covered bridge and down the river. A few more were spotted further downriver, perhaps one of them being the same that had gone over the dam before, bobbing along in the churning waters, and then down into the deep, ragged Quechee Gorge, where a second tank ruptured and vented plumes of propane high into the air. Vermont riverbanks and the roads and homes along them were swept away. Vermont indeed saw the worst of it, for certain. Back in the Berkshires, the flood prevention systems installed so long ago seemed to be holding the worst of it at bay in North Adams, the system's first real test since it was constructed. Trees were down, power losses occurred, but nothing like what used to happen. High water threatened low-lying areas, per usual, but not at the same extreme, nor with the same ferociousness. In Williamstown, a section of homes were ruined, however, when a trailer park called Spruce Park flooded. The park stood between the Hoosick River and Route 2 on a flat floodplain. The entranceway still sports two white lions made of concrete atop pillars. The high floodwaters soaked into the building materials of the trailer homes and caused a myriad of issues. It was decided that the residents would be given help in finding new homes, and that Spruce Park would be leveled. The plan took quite a few years, but now the property is a flat field with a charming pond. Plans have been proposed for a park and a possible extension of the nearby bike path, but as of today, nothing's been constructed, though the lions have gotten a new coat of paint. It is likely that this property will never be built upon again, not with any structures that can't resist a flood, as its location will always be prone to flooding. This was also the problem with the beloved area in Great Barrington. The Great Barrington Fairground was incorporated in 1849, and it was an annual and cherished tradition for people from all over the Berkshires. It was mostly an agricultural fair, much like that of the current Cummington Fair, though it also became a popular place for thoroughbred horse racing, which caused its attendance to boom. In its earlier years, the fact that it had been built on a low-lying floodplain wasn't a problem. Structures and facilities upon the property were simple, and if they were damaged, easy to repair, or if they were flooded, would be okay. But as time went on and more amenities added, high water became more of a threat. Suddenly there were electrical elements to worry about. Entire enclosed buildings were added. An expensive grandstand that could possibly be damaged. Stables and concessions, phone lines, and light fixtures. And all of these little things, all of these little damages, added to great expense when destroyed by flood. On March 19th of 1936, it flooded to a little over 10 feet. On September 22nd of 1938, it flooded to 11.72 feet. On New Year's Day, 1949, floodwaters reached 12 feet. And in May 1984, they were almost 11. Again and again and again, the beloved fairgrounds found themselves underwater. I have here listed 20 separate occasions, and soon it became too much. Attendance declined, operation became more sporadic. After the damages, the lesser attractions and concessions were closed, but the horse racing was kept. In fact, my dad used to paint the signs every year at the fairground and remembers quite clearly how sad he was the year that it wasn't needed that he come back. A tornado swept through the property in 1995, destroying a large portion of the grandstand. It was rebuilt, and horse racing once again undertaken in 1997, but that only lasted 2 more years before the fairgrounds were permanently closed in 1998. It was purchased in 2006 by a company that wanted to build a hotel. However, there was one very large problem. It was on a floodplain with countless high water issues in its past. No one was about to insure a hotel on that property, and frankly, it was important to the river system that it remain undeveloped, not only to curb flooding issues in the town of Great Barrington just to the north, but also in Sheffield to the south. It's also important to wildlife that flooding occur, as marshlands are a rich ecosystem. So the hotel plan never came through, and the property was foreclosed upon in 2010. In 2012, it was sold again, and an endeavor was undertaken upon the property that could work, along with flooding. The fairground was going to return to its roots, back to agriculture, to what the fair had been constructed to show off. It has become a multi-use area for sustainable agriculture, education, and recreation. It also endeavors to preserve the natural importance of the area. Wetland improvements is actually one of the focuses of its new ownership. The dog park, community garden plots, and farmer market space would be minimally affected by flooding. In fact, flooding would re-enrich the soil and thus be a bonus. And through this, part of Berkshire history is preserved. For if it weren't for flooding, there would be a hotel here, and they would no longer be the fairgrounds at all. Yes, flooding has taken a lot from us over the years, in terms of historic buildings and bridges, and of course lives. But the Berkshires are still very deeply wild, and flood is a risk of that, and part of why we love it so much. The best we can do is keep a mindful eye, especially on dams, and be prepared. We can't stop nature, but we can be ready. This has been The Berkshires Gone By, created, written, directed, and read by myself, Brooke Grenier, and co-produced by Deanna Garner. You can follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, and there you'll see a new picture every day related to Berkshire history. You can also find every episode we've ever made on our Facebook page, on YouTube, or by visiting www.theberkshiresgoneby.com, where we not only have every episode, but also pictures related to those specific episodes. We hope you'll join us for our next episode. Thanks for listening.